Hello, this video is going to discuss equilibrium in the markets for goods and services, and in this video we'll be deriving the IS curve. This video is part of Chapter 12, Part 12.1, and also Learning Objective 12.1. Now there's two parts to this video. In the first part, we're just going to cover some preliminary material. That's going to be including the review and an extension of the multiplier from Chapter 10. And then in Part 2, we're going to move on to a spreadsheet-based explanation of the IS curve. So now let's do Part 1. In order to understand the macroeconomic equilibrium, we need to know how changes in the real interest rate will affect spending and ultimately equilibrium output. In order to do this, we're going to have to revisit our multiplier analysis that we discussed in a previous chapter. But we'll be extending that multiplier analysis. Now there's a couple of changes here. The big change is that we're going to be adding interest rate effects to both consumption and investment. We had discussed them in previous chapters, but in our multiplier analysis, we omitted them. For simplicity, we're putting them back in. There's another little change that we're going to take an opportunity to do, and that's the effect of short-run or one-off changes to taxes on consumption. We had left them out in Chapter 10. We're going to put them back in. And our result is going to be an equilibrium output schedule, and we're going to see that that's a declining, a negative, and an inverse function of the real interest rate. And this is the curve that we're going to call the IS curve. And why do we call it the IS curve? Well, we're also going to see that along the IS curve, investment must always equal to be we're going to see this is called the IS curve. And along the IS curve, we're going to find out that investment will always be equal to savings. So let's go back. This is Chapter 10. We made a key assumption, and that autonomous shocks to aggregate demand will have no effect on an economy's long-run capacity to produce goods and services. So therefore, we only need pay attention to the output gap, and the output gap must be equal to the non-structural elements of expenditures. So here we have the output gap: consumption, investment, government, exports, imports. And we discussed them in previous chapters, and everything here is in percent of potential output. So now let's look at our non-structural component of consumption. As you remember, we had a cyclical component. I urge you, if you've forgotten this, to review Chapter 10, but what this is telling us is that we consume some portion. We call this 1 minus the marginal propensity to save out of the gap, or this whole thing here we call the marginal propensity to consume out of our transitory income or our output gap. This is our new element. We omitted it. It's the interest rate effect, and I'm going to discuss that in a second. And this, of course, is our autonomous component, our autonomous shocks to consumption. What does the interest rate effect tell us? It tells us that when the interest rate rises, we tend to pull back on our consumption, and we've expressed this is in terms of a semi-elasticity. That's the percent change in consumption as a fraction of potential output given some basis point change in interest rates. So let's see how we would compute that. Let's assume that that semi-elasticity is minus 0.2. That means if the interest rate goes up by 100 basis point, we'll be cutting back our consumption by 0.2 or 20.2% of potential output. So here's our example. The natural rate of interest is 2.8. The interest rate that we see is above that. It's 4%, so the gap is 1.2. We're going to be cutting back roughly half of that in percent terms. That's 0.24. And then if we assume that our potential output is a little bit over 13 billion, that means that in dollar terms, this increase in the interest rate will be reflected in a cutback of consumption on the order of $31.7 billion. That's the interest rate effect. That's what we're adding here. Now let's look at the non-structural component of investment. Previously, all we had was the autonomous component, but as you'll remember, in Chapter 8, we also had an interest rate effect. Once again, we're going to be expressing this in terms of a semi-elasticity of investment with respect to the interest rate. So let's make an assumption here now. Let's assume that this semi-elasticity is quite a bit higher than it was for consumption, minus 0.6. Once again, if we keep with our example that the interest rate rises to 4% and the natural rate of interest is 2.8%, that means that this gap, 1.2%, will be cutting back our investments, and the cutback of investments will be approximately 0.72% of potential output. And we can see that in dollar terms, in this example, that's approximately a little bit over $95 billion, $95.1 billion cut back in investment as a result of this increase in the interest rate. So now we have some what should be familiar equations. This is our new non-structural consumption and our new non-structural investment. These carry over from Chapter 10, non-structural government, non-structural exports, and non-structural imports that also include a cyclical element. So the idea is that when output goes up, our income goes up as well. We spend some fraction of that in more imports. Okay, so we substitute everything in. What we've done is we've added some interest rate effects here. There's another little change that I said we're going to make, and that is we're going to add the effects of temporary non-structural tax policies. So the idea is, let's suppose that this is $1, and let's suppose that the marginal propensity to save out of each cyclical dollar or transitory dollar is 70%. That means that we'll be consuming only 30% of our tax cut. So if we have a tax cut of $1, we increase our consumption by 30 cents. So the way that this is going to be reflected here is in a new output gap equation, and our new output gap equation has the cyclical components, both from consumption and imports, and then the new interest rate responses. And we're going to call this autonomous shock now. Instead of calling it AUT-AD, now we're going to call it AUT-IS. Why? Because we've stuck in this tax term, because we're going to want to use that later on. And then what we do here is we solve out, once again, for the equilibrium output gap. You'll notice here that we have a multiplier term. This is the same as in Chapter 12. And you'll notice that we're multiplying both by our interest rate response and by our autonomous shock to aggregate demand, inclusive of tax effects. So these are our new elements. So we've just wrapped up the first part, our preliminary material, and we've reviewed the multiplier. So now, if you move on to the next video, you'll see a spreadsheet-based explanation of how we get the IS curve.